A white officer on the lake decides that a young black girl can't possibly have a legal right to a luxury yacht. But just a few minutes later, he'll be facing unexpected consequences. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The shimmering surface of Lake Arbor reflected the late afternoon sunlight, creating a dazzling mosaic of colors. The quiet hum of the surrounding nature, a blend of chirping birds and the occasional rustling of leaves, added to the lake's tranquil atmosphere. This picturesque scene, known for attracting affluent visitors with its pristine waters and luxury yachts, had a history as old as the nearby towns. Lake Arbor wasn't just any lake. It was a haven for those seeking both leisure and luxury, a place where well-to-do families would gather for weekend getaways or host grand events on the water. In the midst of this beauty, a sleek and elegant yacht glided smoothly over the water. Its polished white hull contrasted sharply against the deep blue of the lake, and the deck was equipped with all the trappings of opulence. Comfortable lounge chairs, a small bar, and an open-air sitting area shaded by an awning. The yacht was a sight to behold, commanding attention as it gracefully cut through the water, a testament to its luxurious design. At the helm stood Taylor Monroe, a young black woman with a radiant smile on her face. Her dark, curly hair framed her face, blowing lightly in the breeze. Today, that smile was brighter than ever. Taylor had just been accepted into her dream university, and this day marked the culmination of years of hard work, determination, and sacrifice. She had rented the yacht to celebrate this life-changing moment, a decision that symbolized not only her success, but also her desire to create a memory that would last a lifetime. As Taylor steered the yacht further away from the shore, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. For years, she had juggled a demanding academic schedule, multiple extracurricular activities, and even part-time jobs to ensure she had a strong application. There had been countless late nights spent studying, early mornings filled with stress, and moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But she had persevered, fueled by a deep desire to achieve her goals and prove herself in a world that often underestimated her. She thought back to her parents and their endless support. Her mother had always been there to encourage her, and her father, despite his long hours working to provide for the family, never missed a chance to remind her that she could achieve anything she set her mind to. Then there was her uncle, Uncle Ray, a man who had played a special role in her life. An accomplished yachtsman and prominent figure in the local boating community, Uncle Ray had always been more than just family. He was a mentor, a guiding hand who helped shape her values and encouraged her to chase her dreams. As a child, Taylor often accompanied Uncle Ray on his boats, learning the basics of sailing and soaking up the calmness that came from being on the open water. Those early experiences had sparked a fascination within her, a fascination that now brought her full circle to this very moment. It was Uncle Ray who had suggested she celebrate her achievement in style, renting a yacht to mark the occasion. It was also his influence that had made it possible. He knew the right people, and the arrangements had been easy thanks to his reputation in the boating world. The yacht itself was a masterpiece, a modern vessel equipped with luxurious amenities that made it feel more like a floating palace than a boat. The deck was spacious, furnished with cushioned seats and a small table where she had laid out some snacks and drinks for when her friends arrived. The interior featured a tastefully decorated lounge area and a kitchenette, exuding an air of sophistication that made Taylor feel like she was living in a dream. It was far removed from the realities of her everyday life, and as she admired the craftsmanship around her, a sense of accomplishment washed over her. Standing on the deck, she took a moment to savor the serenity of the lake. Her phone buzzed with a new notification. Friends texting to confirm their arrival time. She glanced at the screen, then back at the lake, allowing herself to bask in the quietude just a little longer. In a short while, her friends would join her, and the day would be filled with laughter, music, and celebration. For now, it was just her and the vast expanse of the water, a perfect setting to reflect on how far she had come. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Taylor took out her phone and began snapping pictures, capturing the beauty of the surroundings. She planned to post a few of them on social media, sharing this special moment with friends and family. Her fingers flew over the screen, typing out a message to go with the images, celebrating in style. The hard work paid off. Can't wait to see what's next. With the photos uploaded, Taylor put her phone away and wandered to the bow of the yacht, where she could get an unobstructed view of the horizon. She closed her eyes, letting the gentle rocking of the boat soothe her as a cool breeze brushed against her skin. It felt as though time had slowed down, giving her space to truly appreciate all she had accomplished. She inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp air, and as she exhaled, a profound sense of gratitude filled her. For a moment, her thoughts wandered to the challenges she had faced along the way. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the times when she had doubted herself. None of it seemed to matter anymore. She had made it. All those moments of struggle had brought her to this point, and now the future seemed filled with endless possibilities. The world was finally opening up to her, and she was ready to embrace it. As she stood there, absorbing the beauty around her, Taylor couldn't help but think of her Uncle Ray. She had invited him to come celebrate with her, and though he was busy with work, she knew he would make an appearance later. She looked forward to thanking him in person for his support and guidance, for teaching her how to navigate not just the waters, but also the challenges of life. A smile tugged at her lips as she imagined his reaction when he saw her taking command of the yacht like a seasoned pro. She could almost hear his voice, full of pride, saying, "That's my girl." It was a thought that filled her with warmth and made the celebration feel even more meaningful. But as Taylor's gaze drifted back towards the shoreline, a faint sense of unease settled over her. She noticed a small patrol boat in the distance, slowly making its way toward her yacht. It was an unusual sight, given the calm nature of the lake and the absence of any visible trouble. Shrugging off the feeling, she turned her attention back to the deck, reminding herself that there was no reason to worry. Yet the patrol boat continued to approach, its presence growing more conspicuous as it drew nearer. Taylor's curiosity gave way to a slight tension in her shoulders, a nagging intuition that this unexpected arrival might not be as harmless as she hoped. As she watched the boat close in, she took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever came next. She had dealt with difficulties before and would handle this too, whatever this turned out to be. The patrol boat steadily approached, its low hum growing louder as it cut through the water towards Taylor's yacht. The once tranquil atmosphere seemed to shift, replaced by an undercurrent of unease that Taylor couldn't quite shake off. She tried to maintain her composure, reminding herself that there was no reason to assume anything was wrong. After all, it was just a routine patrol. At least that's what she hoped. As the boat drew nearer, Taylor noticed a figure standing at the bow. It was a middle-aged man in a uniform, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. The badge on his chest glinted in the sunlight, indicating his rank as an officer with the lake's Marine Patrol. Taylor's gaze fell upon his stern face, framed by a cap pulled low over his forehead, casting a shadow over his eyes. Even from a distance, there was a certain intensity in his demeanor that put her on edge. The patrol boat pulled up alongside the yacht, and the officer, his name tag reading Johnson, called out to her. "Ma'am, please cut the engine and prepare for inspection," he said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that left no room for negotiation. Taylor's heart sank at the abruptness of the command. She had encountered law enforcement before, but never on the water and never in a situation like this. Her thoughts raced as she complied, reaching over to switch off the engine. The yacht slowed to a stop, and she moved towards the edge of the deck to face the officer who had now tied his patrol boat to her yacht. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, doing her best to keep her voice steady and polite, though a slight tremor betrayed her unease. Officer Johnson stepped onto the deck of the yacht, his boots thudding heavily against the polished wood. He took a moment to survey the surroundings, his gaze sweeping over the deck chairs, the drinks, and Taylor herself. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken judgment, as if he had already made up his mind about her. He took off his sunglasses, revealing a pair of cold blue eyes that fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "Whose yacht is this?" he demanded, his tone lacking the courtesy one might expect from a routine check. "And what are you doing out here?" Taylor blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness of his questions. "The yacht is rented," she explained, keeping her voice even. "I rented it for the day to celebrate some good news. I just got accepted into university, and I thought this would be a nice way to celebrate." Johnson's expression didn't soften. Instead, he seemed to grow more skeptical. "Rented, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with doubt. He took another step closer, his presence now looming over her. "And who did you rent it from?" Taylor's pulse quickened. "From my uncle," she answered. "Ray Monroe. He owns a few yachts around here and knows the marina staff well. I can give you his number if you need to verify." But Johnson wasn't interested in verifying anything. He crossed his arms, his posture rigid, and shook his head slightly. "That won't be necessary," he said curtly. "I've been patrolling this lake for years, and I've never seen anyone like you out here on a yacht like this. How do I know this boat isn't stolen?" Taylor felt a knot form in her stomach. "What do you mean, someone like me?" she asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to stay calm. The implication in his words was clear, and it stung more than she cared to admit. Johnson's eyes flickered with something akin to irritation. "I mean, someone your age. Someone who doesn't look like the typical folks we see renting luxury yachts around here," he replied, not bothering to hide the thinly veiled suspicion in his tone. "It's my job to make sure everything is in order." Taylor took a breath, trying to steady herself. She had dealt with this kind of attitude before, people questioning whether she belonged in certain places simply because of how she looked. But here, in the middle of what was supposed to be her celebration, it felt particularly unjust. "Look, officer, I have the rental agreement in the cabin. I can show you the paperwork," she said, gesturing towards the door that led inside. "There's no need for any of this." Johnson's jaw tightened. "Step away from the cabin, ma'am," he ordered. "I'll be the one to check the paperwork. You stay right here." The dismissiveness in his voice grated against her nerves, but she forced herself to comply, stepping back to let him pass. As he disappeared into the cabin, Taylor felt a wave of frustration rise within her. She wasn't a criminal, and she didn't deserve to be treated like one. All she had wanted was a day to celebrate her achievements, and now it seemed like even that was being taken away from her, piece by piece. Minutes dragged by before Officer Johnson emerged from the cabin, a stack of papers in his hand. He glanced down at them, then back at Taylor, the suspicion in his eyes as evident as ever. "These documents don't prove anything," he said dismissively. "For all I know, they could be forged. I'm going to need some more convincing before I'm satisfied." Taylor's temper flared despite her best efforts to stay calm. "What more do you want?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I've shown you everything I have. If you're not going to call my uncle to confirm, then what exactly do you expect me to do?" Johnson took a step closer, lowering his voice as if to assert his control over the situation. "Watch your tone, young lady," he said, a harsh edge creeping into his voice. "I'm just doing my job. If you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't be so defensive." The injustice of his words stung. She knew well enough that being compliant didn't always guarantee fair treatment, and here was a perfect example of that. There was no winning with this man. It was clear that he had already made up his mind about her. Before she could respond, Johnson reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Johnson," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "I'm conducting an investigation on a suspicious yacht at Lake Arbor. I need backup at my location." Taylor's eyes widened. "Backup? For what?" she exclaimed, her frustration giving way to incredulity. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're making this into something it's not." Johnson ignored her, his gaze fixed on the water as he awaited a response from dispatch. The casual way he dismissed her concerns only fueled her anger. It wasn't enough for him to ruin her day. He had to make her feel like a criminal, too. The tension on the yacht was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on her as she stood there, uncertain of what would happen next. She glanced towards the shore, hoping to catch sight of anyone who might be able to help, but the marina was too far away, and the few boats on the lake kept their distance. With each passing second, Taylor felt more isolated, as though the world around her was shrinking. She had done everything right, shown the paperwork, complied with his orders, yet none of it seemed to matter. Her perfect day, once filled with joy and pride, was rapidly unraveling. As Officer Johnson continued to ignore her pleas for fairness, Taylor's thoughts turned to her Uncle Ray. She had mentioned his name, offered his contact information, but the officer hadn't cared. If only she could reach him, he could clear this up in an instant. He would know exactly how to handle this situation, how to put someone like Johnson in his place. But for now, she was on her own, facing down an authority figure who saw her as nothing more than a potential suspect. The sound of a distant boat engine broke the tense silence, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in Taylor's chest. She squinted against the sun, trying to make out the shape of the approaching vessel. Could it be a friendly face? Someone who would finally intervene? The thought was quickly dashed as the boat drew closer, and she recognized the markings of another patrol unit. Backup was on its way. As the second patrol boat approached, its engine's growl cut through the tense silence that hung over the yacht. Taylor watched with a sinking feeling as another officer stepped onto her yacht, his expression almost a mirror image of Johnson's, cold, stern, and unyielding. The presence of two officers only seemed to amplify the situation, making the already suffocating tension even harder to bear. Taylor stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides as she fought to maintain her composure. The new officer, whose badge identified him as Officer Williams, glanced at Taylor before turning his attention to Johnson. "What's going on here?" he asked, casting a wary eye over the yacht's luxurious interior. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, as though he had already assumed that whatever was happening was indeed serious. Johnson didn't waste a moment. "Possible stolen yacht," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as if the conclusion was obvious. "The paperwork is questionable, and she doesn't seem like she belongs here." He tilted his head slightly toward Taylor, his meaning clear even without further elaboration. Taylor's frustration reached a boiling point. "I've already told you," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This yacht is rented from my uncle, Ray Monroe. He's well known around here, and if you'd just call him, he could clear this up. But you're choosing not to. Why?" Williams, who had been eyeing her with a skeptical look, finally spoke, his voice patronizing. "Look, miss, if everything is in order, you'll have nothing to worry about. But until we're certain of that, we need you to cooperate." He turned to Johnson, who handed him the documents and began leafing through the papers with an air of suspicion. "Cooperate?" Taylor echoed, her disbelief spilling over into her words. "I've already shown you everything I have. I've done nothing but cooperate, but you're treating me like a criminal for no reason. What exactly am I supposed to do here?" The officers exchanged a glance, one that carried a silent communication Taylor couldn't decipher. It was the kind of look that implied shared assumptions, mutual distrust of the person standing before them. Johnson took a step closer, his expression hardening. "Watch your tone, young lady," he said, his voice low and warning. "We're just doing our job, and if you have nothing to hide, then there shouldn't be a problem." The dismissal in his tone stung, but Taylor was too furious to back down. "You're making this into a problem," she shot back. "I've told you the truth from the start, but you don't want to believe me because you already decided I don't belong here." Williams, still flipping through the documents, paused and looked at Johnson. "We should probably take her in for questioning, just to be safe," he said, ignoring Taylor's protests. "We can sort out the paperwork at the station." The suggestion hit Taylor like a punch to the gut. "Take me in for questioning?" "For what?" she exclaimed, her voice rising in disbelief. "You have no reason to arrest me. I haven't broken any laws." "Lower your voice," Johnson commanded, his hand moving to rest on his belt where his radio was clipped. "You're not being arrested, yet. We're just taking you in for questioning to make sure everything checks out." The weight of the situation crashed down on Taylor, and she realized just how precarious her position was. The two officers were escalating matters rapidly, and she was powerless to stop them. She had shown them the rental agreement, explained who she was, and even offered to let them contact her uncle, but none of it seemed to matter. It was as if every attempt she made to prove her innocence only further cemented their suspicion. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "If you want to verify something, call my uncle. His number is on the rental papers. There's no reason for you to take me in." William's face darkened. "We've given you a chance to cooperate," he said coolly. "But if you want to make this difficult, we can proceed with detaining you until we get everything sorted out." Before Taylor could respond, the officers moved in, their intentions clear. Johnson reached for her arm, and instinctively she stepped back. The sudden movement seemed to trigger a reaction in both men, who immediately took a more aggressive stance. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Johnson warned, his grip tightening around her arm as he pulled her closer. "Let go of me," Taylor cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her frustration and fear. "This is completely unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong." The commotion drew the attention of nearby boaters and people along the shore. Several onlookers began to gather, murmuring among themselves as they watched the unfolding confrontation. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene as it escalated. "Is everything okay over there?" a voice called from a nearby boat. A couple who had been lounging on their sailboat stared at the scene with concern. Taylor tried to catch the eye of anyone who seemed willing to help. "Please, can someone call my uncle?" she shouted, her voice rising above the officer's gruff commands. "His name is Ray Monroe. He can explain everything." Johnson shot a warning look at the crowd. "Step back, folks," he barked. "This is a police matter." But the sight of two officers forcefully restraining a young woman on a luxury yacht was enough to draw even more attention. People from nearby boats and the shore began to approach, forming a loose crowd around the scene. Their whispers grew louder as they took in the sight of Taylor struggling against the officer's grip. "This doesn't look right," someone murmured, and others nodded in agreement. Taylor could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on her, a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and judgment. Her pulse raced, and a sense of helplessness threatened to overwhelm her. She had been taught that remaining calm and cooperative was the best way to handle encounters with the police, but it didn't seem to matter now. Her compliance hadn't stopped the officers from treating her like a suspect. Williams reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we're bringing a suspect in for questioning," he said, his tone impassive. "Have the station prepared to receive." "No," Taylor's voice broke. "You don't have to do this. This is a mistake." Just as the situation seemed to spiral further out of control, a loud voice cut through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd parted slightly, and Taylor's heart leaped with relief when she saw a familiar figure striding toward the yacht. Her Uncle Ray, dressed in his boating gear, had arrived. His expression was a mix of anger and disbelief as he took in the sight of his niece being restrained by the officers. "Get your hands off her!" he shouted, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who was used to being listened to. "That's my niece, and this is my yacht." Johnson and Williams turned in unison, their grips loosening as they recognized the man approaching. It was clear from the look on their faces that they knew who Ray Monroe was, a well-known figure in the boating community, someone whose reputation could not be easily dismissed. Ray stepped onto the yacht, his eyes blazing as he addressed the officers. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice steady but laced with anger. "She's done nothing wrong. I rented this yacht for her myself." The officers hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing their features. It was the first time they seemed to consider the possibility that they might have overstepped, but they were not yet willing to back down. This young woman was acting suspiciously, and her paperwork was questionable, Johnson began, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments ago. Ray's eyes narrowed. "Questionable?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "The only thing questionable here is your behavior. If you'd taken the time to verify the information instead of assuming guilt, you'd know she had every right to be here." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, with several voices expressing agreement. The tables were beginning to turn, and Taylor felt a surge of relief as her uncle's presence shifted the dynamic in her favor. For the first time since the officers had boarded the yacht, Taylor felt a glimmer of hope. Her uncle wasn't just any bystander. He was a man of influence, and he wasn't going to let this injustice slide. Ray Monroe's commanding presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere on the yacht. The crowd that had gathered around the confrontation grew larger and bolder, their murmurs of disapproval turning into open conversations about what they were witnessing. Camera phones were now held aloft, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Ray's expression was a mixture of barely restrained fury and determination as he stood between Taylor and the officers. Johnson and Williams, visibly unnerved by the sudden change in the situation, glanced at each other, a silent exchange of uncertainty passing between them. It was clear that the arrival of Ray Monroe, a well-known figure in the boating community, had thrown their confident stance into disarray. For the first time, the authority they wielded felt less absolute, more precarious. Ray's voice cut through the rising clamor of the crowd. "You need to let her go, now." His tone brooked no argument, and the crowd fell silent, their attention locked on the confrontation. Johnson's grip loosened further, but his pride was not yet ready to let go. "Sir, with all due respect, we're just doing our job," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. There were legitimate concerns about the ownership of this yacht. The paperwork wasn't clear, and Ray's hand shot up in a gesture that stopped Johnson mid-sentence. "Don't give me that," Ray snapped. "You had every opportunity to confirm the facts before jumping to conclusions. But instead, you chose to escalate the situation based on nothing but assumptions." He pointed towards the rental agreement in William's hand. "You see that paperwork? It's legitimate, and you could have verified that with a simple phone call. But you didn't, because you'd already made up your mind about her," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "You thought she didn't belong because of how she looks, didn't you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Johnson's face flushed a deep red as he struggled to maintain his composure. "That's not true," he stammered. "We were following procedure." Ray took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "Procedure?" he echoed, his voice dripping with incredulity. "What kind of procedure involves handcuffing a young woman who has shown you nothing but cooperation? If this is your idea of protecting and serving, then you're not just wrong, you're dangerous." The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on the officers. Johnson's hand twitched at his side, as though he was considering reaching for his radio again, but the gaze of Ray Monroe bore down on him, forcing him to reconsider. Williams, sensing the shift in the dynamic, finally spoke up, his voice quieter and less sure than before. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here," he said, his tone almost conciliatory. "If there's a misunderstanding, we can clear it up." Ray's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. "That's putting it lightly, don't you think? You were ready to haul my niece off to the station without a shred of evidence that she'd done anything wrong. You were ready to ruin her day, her celebration, all because of your own biases." Taylor, who had remained silent up until now, found her voice. "I showed you the documents," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I gave you my uncle's number. I told you the truth from the start, but you didn't listen. You didn't even try." The officers shifted uneasily, their expressions a mix of frustration and reluctant acknowledgement. The crowd was no longer just an audience. It had become a force of its own, a pressure that was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone from the crowd called out, "Let her go. She hasn't done anything wrong." The voices of others joined in, creating a wave of support that buoyed Taylor's spirit. Ray seized the moment. "You heard them," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Release her, now." Johnson hesitated for a fraction of a second before finally letting out a reluctant sigh. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt, but Ray stopped him with a raised hand. "Don't you dare touch her," he warned. "I'll do it." Stepping forward, Ray took the key from Johnson's outstretched hand and gently unlocked the cuffs from Taylor's wrists. The metal fell away with a soft clink, leaving behind faint red marks where the restraints had pressed into her skin. Taylor rubbed her wrists, the relief flooding through her body almost overwhelming. As Ray helped her steady herself, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, many expressing their outrage at what they had witnessed. "This isn't right," someone said. "She was treated like a criminal for no reason." Ray turned back to the officers, his gaze as cold as steel. "You owe my niece an apology," he said, "and not just for what you did here today, but for every assumption you made about her." Johnson opened his mouth as if to protest, but the glare from Ray and the disapproving stares from the onlookers silenced him. "We were just trying to do our job," he said, his voice now devoid of its former conviction. "But I suppose we might have handled it differently." "You think?" Ray retorted. "Next time, maybe you should handle it differently from the start, because the way you acted today was not only unprofessional, it was disgraceful." The crowd, now emboldened, voiced their agreement. "You owe her more than an apology," someone shouted. "You owe her dignity back." Taylor looked at the officers, her voice steady but firm. "I don't need your apologies if they're not sincere," she said, her eyes locking onto Johnson's. "But I do want you to think about why you did what you did. Because this wasn't about following procedure. This was about you seeing me and assuming the worst." Johnson and Williams shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The crowd's attention had now fully turned towards them, the weight of public judgment pressing down. Taylor's words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if the officers were at a loss for how to respond. But before they could muster a reply, Ray took a step forward, his gaze burning with intensity. "Let's hope you learned something today," he said, his voice low and edged with warning. "Because next time I won't be as forgiving." With that, he turned back to Taylor, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Come on, kid," he said softly. "Let's get you off this boat. You've had enough excitement for one day." As they stepped off the yacht, the crowd parted to let them through, offering words of support and encouragement to Taylor. Some even extended their hands in solidarity, their expressions a mix of respect and admiration for the young woman who had stood her ground. As Ray and Taylor reached the dock, a few of the onlookers approached them, expressing their outrage at how she had been treated. Ray thanked them, but his focus remained on Taylor. He could see the weight of the experience still lingering in her eyes, the marks on her wrists a reminder of how close the day had come to ending in tragedy rather than triumph. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle as he guided her away from the crowd. "I'm sorry, I didn't get here sooner." Taylor nodded, though her gaze was distant. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "It's just, I didn't think it could happen like this. Not here, not today." Ray squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "You handled yourself better than most people would have," he said. "And that's what matters." As they walked away, Taylor glanced back at the yacht one last time. The officers remained on deck, looking small and uncertain amidst the aftermath of the confrontation. She could see the cameras still pointed at them, the murmurs of the crowd now focused on the need for accountability. For Taylor, the ordeal had been an unexpected test of her resolve. But as she walked beside her uncle, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She hadn't just survived the encounter. She had stood up for herself and refused to be silenced. And in that moment, she realized that the celebration wasn't over yet. As Taylor and Ray moved away from the yacht, the crowd remained abuzz with murmurs of outrage and support. The people who had witnessed the incident were still processing what they had seen, their discussions filled with words like disgraceful and unjust. Some onlookers continued filming, even as the officers tried to reassert a semblance of control over the situation. The weight of public judgment was palpable, pressing down on Johnson and Williams, who now found themselves under the same scrutiny they had imposed on Taylor. Ray noticed that the officers were beginning to move toward the crowd, perhaps in an attempt to explain or deflect the criticism. Not wanting to let the moment slip away, he stopped and turned to face them once more. His voice carried an air of authority that cut through the noise, bringing a hush over the onlookers. "Before you go anywhere," he said, his tone sharp, "we need to address what just happened here." Johnson and Williams froze in their tracks, the eyes of the crowd now boring into them with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Ray's expression was a mixture of anger and disappointment as he stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the two officers. "You treated my niece like a criminal," he continued, "based on nothing but your own assumptions. You ignored the facts, you dismissed her explanations, and you escalated a situation that should never have become what it did." Williams shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Look, sir," he began, "we were just trying to make sure—" "Make sure of what?" Ray interrupted, his voice rising in indignation. "Make sure that a young black woman didn't have the audacity to be on a luxury yacht? Make sure that she knew her place? Because that's exactly what it looked like to all of us." The crowd voiced its agreement, their murmurs swelling into a chorus of condemnation. "He's right," someone called out. "You had no reason to treat her that way." Johnson tried to regain control of the narrative, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We were following procedure," he said, glancing nervously at the faces surrounding him. "We had to check to make sure everything was legitimate. That's our job." "Procedure?" Ray's voice was thick with sarcasm. "Is that the excuse you're going to hide behind? Because it sure didn't look like procedure when you put handcuffs on my niece without cause. It looked like prejudice." Taylor, who had been standing quietly beside her uncle, stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the officers directly. "You didn't even give me a chance," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "I showed you the rental agreement. I told you who my uncle was. I did everything I was supposed to do, but it didn't matter. It was like you had already decided that I didn't belong here." The truth in her words hung in the air, undeniable and powerful. Johnson and Williams exchanged a glance, and for a moment it seemed as though they were at a loss for what to say. Their earlier confidence had drained away, leaving behind only the uncomfortable realization that they were now the ones on trial, judged not by a court but by the community they were supposed to protect. Ray seized the moment, addressing the crowd as much as the officers. "We talk a lot about protecting and serving," he said, his voice carrying over the restless murmurs of the onlookers. "But what good is that motto if we allow our biases to blind us to the truth? Today, you two saw a young woman who didn't fit your image of who should be on that yacht, and instead of questioning your own assumptions, you questioned her right to be here." The crowd responded with nods of agreement and scattered applause. The mounting pressure from the onlookers was unmistakable, and it was clear that the tide of public opinion had firmly turned against the officers. Johnson's face reddened further, and Williams stared at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. One by one, members of the crowd began to step forward, their expressions filled with quiet condemnation. "We saw what happened," a woman near the front said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You treated that girl like she was guilty from the start. It wasn't right." Another voice joined in, this time a middle-aged man who had watched the entire confrontation unfold. "This is why people don't trust the police," he said, his tone heavy with frustration. "This is why we're afraid. Because you don't see us. You see what you want to see." The officers, now surrounded by a ring of disapproval, seemed to shrink under the weight of the crowd's judgment. Their authority, once so certain, had crumbled beneath the force of the community's outrage. Every attempt to justify their actions only deepened the scorn of the onlookers, and the realization of how thoroughly they had misjudged the situation was written plainly on their faces. Taylor's eyes met Johnson's, and she spoke with a firmness that came from deep within. "I'm not asking for much," she said, "just a little respect. That's all I wanted from the start, but instead, you chose to treat me like I didn't deserve to be here." Johnson swallowed hard, his expression shifting from defiance to something closer to remorse. We might have overreacted," he admitted quietly, though his words did little to quell the anger in the air. Ray took a step closer, his eyes piercing through Johnson's fragile apology. "Might have?" he echoed. "You absolutely overreacted, and it's time you acknowledged the real reason why." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Johnson let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping as he finally met Taylor's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't have treated you like that. It was wrong." Taylor held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She could see that the apology wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but at least it was a start, a small step toward accountability. "I appreciate the apology," she said, her tone steady, "but an apology isn't enough. You need to think about why this happened in the first place, because I'm not the only person this has happened to, and I won't be the last if things don't change." The crowd murmured in agreement, their expressions reflecting a shared sense of determination. It wasn't just about Taylor anymore. It was about the broader issue of how people like her were often treated. The incident had struck a nerve, igniting a desire for change that went beyond the boundaries of the marina. Ray nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We need to do better," he said, addressing not just the officers, but everyone within earshot. "We need to make sure that we're protecting and serving everyone, not just the people who look a certain way or come from a certain background. We owe it to our community to do better." As the crowd began to disperse, the murmurs of disapproval slowly giving way to conversations about what needed to change, Taylor felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Ray, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You did good, kid," he said quietly. "You stood up for yourself, and you made them listen." Taylor nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I had to," she said, "not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong." The two of them turned to walk away, leaving the officers behind to face the lingering stares of the few onlookers who remained. As Taylor and Ray made their way down the dock, she could hear snippets of conversations, people talking about the need for change, about accountability, about fairness. It was a conversation that had been long overdue, and Taylor was proud to have played a part in starting it. For Johnson and Williams, the experience had been a harsh lesson in humility. As they stood on the yacht, their authority diminished and their reputations bruised, they couldn't escape the realization that they had been wrong. And though the crowd was beginning to thin, the echoes of what had happened would linger, serving as a reminder that their actions had consequences. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over Lake Arbor as Taylor and Ray walked away from the crowd, their footsteps echoing against the wooden dock. The day had taken a toll on Taylor, and the adrenaline that had fueled her through the confrontation was now ebbing away, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on her, but alongside it was a sense of accomplishment. She had stood up for herself, refused to back down, and now there was no turning back. As they neared the parking lot, a few of the onlookers approached Taylor and Ray, their faces reflecting a blend of support and outrage. One woman, her voice trembling with emotion, said, "What you went through back there, it wasn't right. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that." Taylor gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she replied quietly. "It means a lot." Another man stepped forward, his tone firm and determined. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his eyes darting back toward the marina where the officers still lingered. "People need to know that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable." Ray nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right," he said. "We've got to do more than just talk about it, though. We need to hold people accountable, and we need to push for real changes." The small group exchanged contact information, pledging to stay in touch and discuss how they could bring the issue to the attention of the local authorities. As they spoke, it became clear that the incident on the yacht had struck a chord, igniting a spark for change that extended beyond the marina. Taylor felt a sense of solidarity with these strangers who had witnessed her struggle and chosen to stand by her side. When the conversations wound down, Taylor and Ray continued walking toward his car. Ray glanced at his niece, a look of pride mingled with concern on his face. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle. "It's been a long day." Taylor took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'm okay," she said, though there was a lingering heaviness in her tone. "It's just, I didn't expect any of this. I thought today was going to be about celebrating, and instead, I ended up having to defend my right to be here." Ray squeezed her shoulder. "You did more than just defend yourself, Taylor," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You made them see that you weren't going to back down. You showed everyone that you're stronger than their assumptions." Taylor gave him a grateful look. "I just wish I didn't have to," she admitted. "I wish I could have just had a normal day." "I know," Ray said softly, "but sometimes life doesn't give us that option. Sometimes we're forced to show our strength when we least expect it." As they reached the car, Taylor paused, her gaze drifting back toward the marina. The officers had finally left the yacht and were walking toward their patrol boats, their postures less confident than before. The image of them standing on the deck, diminished and exposed, was still fresh in her mind. "You think they'll actually learn from this?" she asked, a note of skepticism in her voice. Ray's expression turned thoughtful. "I hope so," he said. "But even if they don't, today wasn't just about them. It was about making sure that people like you don't have to go through this again. It was about showing the community that we won't stay silent in the face of injustice." Taylor nodded, a newfound determination hardening her resolve. She knew that her experience was not unique, that many others had faced similar injustices and felt the same helplessness she had. But if her voice could help bring about even a small change, then she had to use it. The incident had become a turning point for her, transforming a painful moment into a source of empowerment. As they climbed into the car and drove away from the marina, Taylor's thoughts wandered back to the conversation she'd had earlier with the onlookers who had rallied around her. The support they had shown gave her hope that there could be a real movement for change, that people were ready to stand up and demand accountability. Over the next few days, the story of what had happened at Lake Arbor spread throughout the community. Videos of the incident, captured by bystanders, were shared on social media, sparking widespread outrage and igniting discussions about the need for greater oversight of law enforcement. Taylor's experience became a catalyst for a larger conversation about prejudice and authority, with many community members voicing their concerns about how people were treated based on appearances and assumptions. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing Taylor, Ray, and several of the witnesses who had seen the confrontation firsthand. The footage of Taylor standing her ground on the yacht, refusing to be silenced, became a powerful symbol of resilience. It resonated with many, especially those who had experienced similar treatment in other areas of their lives. In response to the public outcry, the local police department announced an internal review of the officers' conduct and implemented immediate changes to their training policies. Officers were now required to undergo additional training on bias and de-escalation, with a renewed focus on treating all citizens with respect. Community oversight committees were also formed, allowing residents to participate in discussions about how law enforcement could better serve and protect everyone, regardless of background. The marina itself introduced new policies to ensure that incidents like what happened to Taylor would not be repeated. Boating regulations were updated to include procedures for officers to verify the legitimacy of rental agreements without escalating situations unnecessarily. The marina staff began working closely with community leaders to improve relationships and build trust. For Taylor, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. She received messages from people she had never met, thanking her for standing up and sharing their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination. Each message reminded her that the fight for justice was far from over, but it was a fight worth having. Her story had given others the courage to speak up, and she was determined to keep the momentum going. Sitting at her uncle's kitchen table one evening, Taylor reflected on everything that had transpired. She glanced at the framed photos on the wall, pictures of Ray and his boats, of family gatherings of a life filled with memories and milestones. In a way, the yacht incident was now part of that story, another chapter in the ongoing journey of resilience and resistance. Ray, who was standing by the stove making coffee, noticed the thoughtful look on Taylor's face. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked, turning to face her. Taylor met his gaze, a small smile forming on her lips. "I was just thinking about everything that's happened," she said, "about how one moment can change everything." Ray nodded, setting the coffee pot down and pulling out a chair to sit beside her. "It's true," he said. "Sometimes the most unexpected moments are the ones that shape us the most. But remember, it wasn't just the moment itself. It was how you responded to it. You didn't let it break you. You turned it into something stronger." Taylor reached out and took her uncle's hand. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without you," she said softly. "You've always been there for me." "And I always will be," Ray replied, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "But don't forget, you're the one who stood up and made your voice heard. That's your strength, Taylor. Don't ever lose it." As the evening wore on, they sat together discussing plans for the future. Taylor expressed an interest in joining some of the community groups that had formed in the wake of the incident. She wanted to be a part of the movement to bring about change, to make sure that her experience helped pave the way for a fairer world. Ray listened with pride, offering his support and sharing his own experiences with activism and standing up for what was right. In the months that followed, Taylor became an active advocate for social justice, speaking at community meetings and participating in events aimed at promoting equality and accountability. Her story continued to inspire others, and she found herself surrounded by people who shared her vision for a better future. The marina incident had marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she wasn't just a victim of prejudice, but a fighter for justice. As Taylor moved forward, she carried with her the lessons learned from that day on Lake Arbor. She understood that there would always be challenges, moments when her right to be seen and heard might be questioned. But she also knew that she had the strength to push back, to demand respect, and to build a world where dignity was not a privilege, but a right for everyone. And so, with a heart full of hope and a mindset on change, Taylor embraced the future, ready to continue the fight, not just for herself, but for all those who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories. Click on the bell to stay up to date with any updates. In the meantime, check out our other videos. I'm sure there's plenty more for you to enjoy.